You're listening to Rebel Justice, the podcast from The View magazine. When we think about justice, we think about it as an abstract, something that happens to someone else, somewhere else. But justice and the law regulate every aspect of our interactions with each other, with organisations, with the government. We never think about it until it impacts our lives or those of someone else. Our guests are women with lived experience of the justice system, whether as victims or women who have committed crimes, people at the forefront of civic action who put their lives on the line to demand a better world. We ask them to share their insight into how we might repair a broken and harmful system with humanity and dignity. We also speak with people who are in the heart of the justice system, creating important change: judges, barristers, human rights campaigners, mental health advocates, artists, and healers. Today we've got Dr Bisi Akintoye. She is a criminologist whose research focuses on the intersection between race, drugs, policing, and youth experiences. She has been an author on numerous research papers exploring the role played by race and racism in the treatment of Black communities by police and the criminal justice system, always applying an intersectional lens to experiences explored. Bisi, would you like to introduce yourself?
I would. Thanks, Louisa. Nice to be here. So my name is Dr Bisi Akintoye. I'm a lecturer in criminology and criminal justice at the University of Roehampton. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Okay, so first, I understand that you focus a lot on intersectionality and how that impacts different individuals. If we understand where the framework first started, it was sort of began 35 years ago with a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw.
Mm-hmm.
In that time, how much do you think the criminal justice system has actually moved in understanding that Black women's experiences can't be separated into race issues on one hand and women's issues on the other?
It's a good first question. I think the first and most accurate answer is that the system's kind of moved in language more than in practice. So intersectionality, in the way that Kimberly Crenshaw argued, is that it's not, we can't think about these things as add-ons. So we don't think about race and gender and class and immigration separately. You know, we have to adopt this kind of anti-racist and feminist analysis that looks at these interlocking oppressions and how these multiple forms of oppression can affect people's lived experience. So intersectionality is really kind of core to correcting how institutions erase Black women by forcing their experiences into these kind of single category frameworks of either race or gender or class. So the way Crenshaw kind of describes it, it's like, you know, Black women aren't simply race and gender added together, but it's this distinct experience, you know, this distinct form of kind of structural harm. To your question, I think there has been more awareness in policy and research and public discourse, even of the term itself. I think it's a term that I guess the average person wouldn't have heard of 10 years ago. But, you know, when we look at the persistence of disproportionality across the criminal justice system, you know, from stop and search through to arrest, caution, conviction, all the way through, we can see that awareness hasn't been matched by, you know, actual institutional transformation. I think there has been some kind of rhetorical adoption of intersectionality. So, for example, in the Equality Act 2010, certain diversity strategies, some examples of MOJ reporting kind of highlights these kind of multiple oppressions that Crenshaw talks about when she speaks about intersectionality. But for example, in the Lamy review of 2017 of, you know, structural inequality in the criminal justice system, it highlighted systemic bias, but it was still kind of largely focused on you know, race in the context of male-dominated pathways. So, you know, this kind of classic experience of the criminalized, racialized Black male. But in practice, you know, in the criminal justice context, it means that Black women are still too often treated either as women in ways that center white femininity, or as Black people in ways that center Black masculinity. So the kind of falling between those kind of two gaps, like overlooked in the race research and in the gender research. So their lives are really, kind of really rarely analyzed on their own terms. I think the criminal justice system and the system more broadly tends to kind of silo inequality. So we see race disparity reports that are separate from gender defending, but we don't have that kind of more complex picture of how Black and brown women actually experience the criminal justice system. So Black and brown women kind of become statistically invisible, kind of falling between these kind of two frameworks. So when we actually look at the criminal justice outcomes, they're not, those experiences aren't read as kind of structurally connected. They're kind of, ongoingly treated in a fragmented way, which is exactly what intersectionality is trying to address.
Yes, I mean, you touched upon how the conversation often defaults onto young Black men, and although it is an incredibly important topic to discuss, what do you feel like gets missed when Black women are left out of that frame?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with you. It is incredibly important. And when we look at the numbers, that is that is the kind of the dominant phenomenon. So, it does make sense to a point that this discussion should focus on the criminalized Black male, because Black men have been historically criminalized and racialized, in the West, like in Britain. But what it does mean is the experiences of Black women and girls kind of remain hidden, remain visible, relatively unexplored. So I'd say, the policing of Black women and girls has kind of increasingly come into focus in recent years. So I'm thinking about, in the context of kind of female gang membership and drug couriering, drug law enforcement, that kind of thing. The Black girls who are victims of abuse or exploitation are often misidentified as perpetrators. So that's a pattern that we kind of see in cases of child sexual exploitation, county lines, drugs, and gangs. So we've had a lot of attempts at reform over the years, but they've been kind of unsuccessful. We haven't been able to tackle some of these disproportionalities. What we tend to see with the experiences of Black women and girls in the criminal justice system is, instead of safeguarding, what they're getting too frequently is surveillance, punishment, criminalization, racialization in a way that really mirrors the experiences of their male counterparts. And I think, what that highlights is, whose vulnerability is recognized, whose vulnerability is protected, who's believed by institutions. The dominant public narrative usually focuses on, police, coercive policing practices, stop and search, street level enforcement, gang discourse. So, while those things are important, what they can do in reality and practice is to obscure some of these quieter forms of control that shape Black women's lives. So thinking about things like, school exclusion, welfare surveillance, things like housing insecurity, intimate partner violence, maternal, poor maternity care, healthcare inequalities. So when the conversation defaults to young Black men, what happens in practice is we kind of lose sight of the fact that Black women are criminalized through different and more invisible pathways. So, there's been some research done by the Prison Reform Trust that shows that Black, Asian, and minority ethnic women are overrepresented in, women's prison populations. And these disadvantages are really compounded by, racial and gender discrimination in custody, and then also kind of in broader society. Also, similarly, the Institute of Race Relations has kind of documented these really serious disparities that affect Black women and girls, including racialized use of strip search, and wide overrepresentation of Black and minority ethnic people, including women, throughout the criminal justice system. So leaving Black women out kind of means we miss how racism and sexism, institutionalized misogyny combine to make them seem more likely to be seen as, kind of non-protectable. So not seen as innocent enough to be treated as victims, but not visible enough to be counted properly as people who are harmed or experience harm. So, for example, a Black woman or a Black girl who's been repeatedly sexually exploited can end up being criminalized for the consequences of that exploitation in the context of county lines, for example, while the original harm, the sexual exploitation of that Black woman or girl, receives little institutional attention. So the institution becomes concerned at the point of the criminality, but not at the initial point of vulnerability. So, that violence against Black women and girls is often less likely to be recognized as exploitation and much more likely to be criminalized, in keeping with the kind of broader criminalization of ethnic minority communities in Britain overall. So what we're missing is, how kind of race, gender, poverty, and victimization all kind of intersect in these cycles of criminalization. The really broad issue is that when Black women's experiences are absent from the picture. So when we try to think of policy solutions, we're not thinking about the population overall, and that tends to reproduce inequality rather than address it or reduce it.
Yeah. I mean, if we talk about young women of colour, how do you feel like that early systematic racism, for those who do turn into sort of an offending lifestyle, how do you feel like that plays a part into that beginning?
I think it plays a really huge part. I think early systemic racism really shapes life courses and it shapes life chances before, there's even any opportunity for an offense to occur. Like it starts in schools, it starts in, neighborhoods, in housing, in healthcare, in, community policing. And then it kind of more generally starts with this kind of everyday expectation that Black girls are harder or older or more resilient than their peers, kind of less vulnerable. So, research looking at Black women's experiences in the criminal justice system shows that, we're kind of routinely seen as troublemakers, really heavily supervised, given harsher punishments than, white female counterparts. For a lot of young Black women, the pathway into offending it's often not like a kind of linear story of individual choice. It's often about, what you might call cumulative disadvantage. So it's things like exclusion from school, instability at home, poverty, mental health strain, coercion, exploitation, all those things. So these things really matter because Black girls are often kind of criminalized through relational and survival based pathways rather than some of the other, the modes of criminalization that like we often talk about in the media, the kind of more stereotypical models that are used when we talk about youth offending. So, from my research takes an intersectional approach to look at the lived experience of racialized policing in a neighborhood in North London. And so I spoke to a number of young people, boys and girls, and their parents and community workers to try and get an insight into how heavy policing of this very heavily policed neighborhood, what kind of impact that has had on communities, on young people, on their sense of self, on their identity and their status and all those sorts of things. We have the data that shows young Black people get stop and search significantly more than their white counterparts, often for drug offenses. But there's not necessarily that much insight always into how that disproportionality is experienced. So what I found in my research looking at Black girls was they're kind of disproportionately subjected to stop and search in the same way a lot of the boys are. And also, kind of more likely to be treated as suspects rather than victims. So I spoke to lots of young Black girls and women who reported being followed, harassed, and approached aggressively by police officers during routine interactions. Other research finds, Black women are much more likely to be imprisoned for drug offenses than their white counterparts, also overrepresented in use of force data. One thing that complicates this analysis is there's a real lack of disaggregated data on race and gender and policing statistics. So what I mean by that is we don't have a full picture of how many Black women get stop and search or how many Muslim women get stop and search, for example. So there's incomplete and separate data that kind of can focus on either gender or race. So most police data sets and, some of the data the Home Office releases doesn't account for Black women, Black females as a specific category. So that makes it really difficult to measure the scale of, racialized policing that they face. We do know that there's been an increase in stop and search of women, and the majority of that is Black women. And Black women have also accounted for an increase in use of force incidents by the police, despite representing only 2% of the population. It's a thing that comes up in the media once in a while, not very often. I'm thinking of, the Child Q, which is a case that I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be aware of. So that's the 15-year-old girl in Hackney who was strip searched by the police at her school with no adult present. And in the review of that case, one of the kind of core findings, like one of the reasons that it happened was identified to be adultification bias. So that's, where Black girls are perceived as older and less innocent. So that's like, that case study was a really good example of what a lot of Black girls are experiencing, but without much, I don't know, that historically has tended to be not much focus or not much discussion about the specific ways Black girls experience harm, in these various settings inside and outside of the criminal justice system. There's a more recent data has shown that Black children are disproportionately subject to strip searches in school and custody settings, often without, appropriate adult supervision, just like in the case of Child Q. And, Black girls are disproportionately subject to surveillance and punished in educational settings, drawing on some of these kind of long-standing stereotypes of like Black girls being aggressive, stereotypes of the angry Black woman and all that kind of thing. In the school context, Black Caribbean pupils are much more likely to be excluded than white British pupils. And that matters because exclusion is one of the kind of strongest predictors of involvement in youth justice or being drawn into the criminal justice system. So, for example, a girl who's repeatedly excluded from school can become more exposed to unsafe relationships or, peer networks that offer belonging, but then also kind of increase the likelihood of risk of being drawn into criminal networks. And then, by the time the system notices this girl, it can be in the punitive mode rather than a preventative mode. I think we also do tend to miss some of the other broader pictures, like things like maternal separation and, the care system overlap and mental health pathways into offending. So these systemic inequalities, systemic racism, they increase the likelihood of punishment, and they also create the conditions that make punishment much more likely in the first place.
I mean, your research just shows how important that sort of youth experience is into preventing going into that offending lifestyle. How important would you say schemes that, help underrepresented communities in employment are in terms of aiding young people avoiding going into criminal lifestyle or being involved in youth violence? Because, there's a rise in very harmful political parties that are trying to take that away. So how important would you say it is?
Employment schemes, I think they're crucial, but I think they're only crucial when they're actually substantive and not just symbolic. Lots of research, government's own data and analysis, when we talk about race disparities, has highlighted the importance of education, training, social mobility. All of these things really determine outcomes for young people. So even, when that research or that data has not necessarily highlighted the significance of race, it still highlighted the importance of these employment schemes and these kind of pathways. And, lots of, I won't go into too much academic research, but lots of research around desistance or, stopping people from committing crimes shows that employment is really linked to reducing reoffending, particularly for people once they're coming out of prison, because it can be very difficult for people to find employment outside, after being incarcerated. It can be very difficult to even just get a job, let alone hold one down. But for Black women and girls especially, what we have more broadly is, labor market discrimination really persists. There are examples of, lots of examples actually, of bias around people's names. So there have been studies done that show that, ethnic minority applicants receive much fewer callbacks than people with so-called, kind of white-sounding names. Women also leaving custody can face housing and childcare barriers that can make it really difficult to find work, but then also to maintain work, hold down work. So these schemes are really important. But like anything, it can only work if they actually kind of are mindful of and seek to address this kind of structural inequalities in hiring practices and finding houses, and not framing these things as just purely skills deficits. So the goal is, of course, to keep young people from avoiding criminal lifestyles and, involvement in kind of youth violence. And, young people are very wary of, what the system might tell them about, kind of aspirational messaging about opportunity, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and all those sorts of all that kind of old rhetoric. What they actually need is access to stable work, paid training. Mentoring programs are really key, especially for, heavily policed, racialized, criminalized communities. Practical things like transport support, mental health support, all of these things are all really significant. Having uninterrupted education, all of those things are really key to providing young people with the tools to find and hold down that kind of secure work. So I think employment schemes kind of work best when they intentionally seek to reduce the gap between exclusion and belonging. Because work isn't just about income, it's also about how young people see themselves, about what hopes they have for themselves, about their identity and their future orientation and social protection and all those things. So, for young women specifically, for young Black women specifically, I think employment schemes need to be really linked to things like childcare, transport, trauma-informed practice, safeguarding. And that's how they can become useful for the people that really kind of need them the most. So they really just do need to have this kind of deeply embedded anti-racist, anti-poverty and anti-exclusion strategy within them for them to actually be workable and helpful.
Yeah. When you were talking about the surnames in terms of how individuals feel like it impacts their employment, my mum, her maiden name was a Middle Eastern Muslim surname, and she felt like in the 80s it was impacting her chances of getting employment. And the fact that that's still prevalent today,
Yeah, it's not just the 80s. They've done studies recently that, they'll send out identical CVs, and some of them will say, have like a stereotypically Muslim name. We'll say Ali Muhammad on it or something. And then same CV with a generic British name, John Smith. And John Smith gets considerably more. I can't remember the exact number, to be honest with you, but, considerably more callbacks than identical CV. And I think that kind of really speaks to how deeply embedded, these kind of racialized ideas are. Despite, I think Britain often likes to think of itself as being kind of post-racial, especially in comparison to America. But I think the reality is, we've never really have reckoned with our racialized history in Britain. We've never really held we haven't really held up the mirror to ourselves, kind of historically, or how these things kind of play out today. So what that means is these, kind of really deeply embedded racialized inequalities just continue from generation to generation without ever being examined.
Moving on to more policing, do you feel like there is adequate police training to, prevent that racist-driven policing and if you feel like there should be more rigid anti-racist programs or learning in early education to have that sort of early intervention?
Well, building on what we were just saying, no, I don't think current policing training is adequate, because we can see it's not. We can see the continued racial disproportionality in stop and search, in arrest, in the use of force. So I think, and this is after, reform attempt after reform attempt. We've been talking about racialized policing for a long time. It's not a new discussion. So in my research, I spoke to people who experienced really heavy policing, really heavy and, overtly violent policing in the 70s and the 80s, and, kind of pre, the Macpherson report, pre Stephen Lawrence's murder, pre the finding of institutional racism. And I guess you could say there are some differences. So the older generations who I spoke to, they had really intense stories of police violence, police racism, being called slurs, with a kind of overt violence and a distinct lack of accountability. So when I speak to young people now, I guess the slurs have probably decreased. Some of the examples of extreme violence have decreased, but the way the young people kind of see it, the way they experience that policing, there are very few differences between the way, a young person in 2026 might talk about policing as somebody, an older person who experienced policing in the 70s. And policing training is part of it, but it's also just not a question of individual bias. This is an institutional problem. It's about kind of structural decision making. Who is seen as criminal? What neighborhoods do the police want to target? So, these stop and search disparities, they persist despite reforms because it's bigger than training. But at the same time, the police are simply a reflection of the society and the culture that they come from. So while we have this evidence of disproportionate outcomes across the system, it's not about individual prejudice. This is an institutional practice. The police is still institutionally racist in the way that it was in the 70s, in the way that it was when Stephen Lawrence was killed, in the way that it was after we had this term institutional racism applied to the police in the Macpherson Report in 1999 and today. So it's a broader issue of the really, deeply embedded racism in Britain, inside and outside of the criminal justice system. And the police is simply an operation of that. It's simply the mechanism for that to be shown, displayed, enforced. So that's why anti-racist work, I think, needs to start really early. It needs to start in way before they're getting police training. It needs to start in schools and in community settings. But it also, of course, needs to continue in professional training and in institutional governance. If we're thinking about school, really early education has to include the history of empire, the history of migration, the history of race, history of institutional racism. Going to school in the early 2000s, there was no history of British colonial endeavor on my syllabus, on my history syllabus. And I think that's part of the problem kind of more broadly, people are not necessarily aware of some of the racialized histories of, the British Empire. So I think, if it will go some way to, giving some people some of that kind of broader context early. So they don't encounter the idea of race as a thing that is either in the past or, something that's a polarized issue that we need to debate the existence of. And that, they might need to take a defensive stance on. So for example, in practice, a police officer who hasn't been trained to understand something like how Black girls experience adultification, they may misread what is actually distress as defiance, or they may misread assertiveness as threat, and that can lead to, criminal justice outcomes. So it's really important for kind of long-term cultural change, but it also has to be paired with institutional reform and an acknowledgement of the significance of race when we talk about the experiences of Black people in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about how Britain sort of likes to take pride in how they're so different to America.
Yeah.
But in school, I mean, I started secondary school in 2015, and it was talking about history. It was just a lot about slavery in America, nothing about the history of Britain. So it still hasn't changed in the syllabus.
Yeah, I mean, so we had, the Tudors.
Yeah.
We skipped a few hundred years worth of history. And then we had the Victorians or something. And then, World War II. But, there's a big and conspicuous gap somewhere in the middle there about what Britain was doing and how that leads to migration patterns in, the 21st century. It really kind of shines a light on the hypocrisy around the shift to the right politically in Britain kind of more broadly. But I mean, a lot of that, and again, that is an institutional, that's a byproduct of the decision to not teach, not frame the curriculum in that way. I mean, maybe it's changed. I don't know. I don't know if the curriculum has changed in a kind of post 2020 BLM context. But I do know that I only really became aware of colonialism when I kind of taught it to myself at university. It wasn't a thing part of my syllabus at school.
Talking about with far right political parties, in terms of the rising of Reform Party, how do you feel like that's sort of impacting the safety of women of colour, and especially with in terms of stop and search?
I think it's impacting it quite significantly, but mainly around rhetoric. I guess you could say, I think it's important to separate, crime safety discourse, which is what Reform like to amplify, supposedly, and then actual evidence-based, policy impact. The thing with parties like Reform is their whole thing is they're framing social problems through anti-immigrant discourse and kind of cultural panic and cultural anxieties about, you know, the British way of life and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is they can have those things can have really serious implications for women of color, because it shifts public attention away from structural violence that women are experiencing to racialized blame. What they do is they focus on criminalizing men, claiming that they're, you know, seeking to protect women, implicitly only white British women. And, you know, but in reality, what they're actually doing is leaving women overlooked. Obviously, their goal is divisive and their goal is political. So they're using something that they think, you know, they're kind of claiming that they're taking this protective stance. But of course, it's not about making women safer. Lots of research on you know, these kind of politicized examples of law and order rhetoric show that what it does is, in reality, just increases suspicion towards minority communities across genders, at the same time as, you know, reinforcing really old racialized threat narratives. So in practice, that means that, you know, safety, the concept of safety, is being invoked in really selective and exclusionary ways. The woman being protected as imagined by Tommy Robinson and his gang, you know, that woman is implicitly a white native woman, white British woman, a culturally familiar woman. That's, you know, that's the idea that they have in their minds. While women of color are treated as peripheral, irrelevant, or even, you know, actively suspicious. So that really matters because, you know, Black and brown women are already navigating misogyny, navigating racism, Islamophobia, xenophobia in public life. And when the political discourse becomes heightened in the way that it is now, that what that does is it actually just increases fear rather than, you know, enhancing security for anyone. One of the clearest examples with this kind of protecting women rhetoric is like anti-immigration politics, and they kind of ignore the actual infrastructures in which women are harmed and the ones that keep women safe. So, you know, housing, welfare, schools, healthcare, you know, intimate partner violence, abuse services. None of it is about strengthening those, funding those, you know, like increasing awareness about resources. It's about criminalizing groups as suspect. So using that rhetoric to kind of whip up, to get people in a frenzy, you know, like justify stronger law enforcement responses, you know, stronger immigration policing, you know, increasing police powers, all those things. So you can see the link between the political rhetoric and the actual, like, you know, the criminal justice experience, you know, people being drawn into the criminal justice system. So the debate publicly is, you know, fixated on migrants as a source of danger, as a source of risk. But what it does is it also obscures the actual violence, the actual harm towards women taking place in the home, you know, in schools, in workplaces. Like, those are the places where women of all colors are actually at risk. You know, that politics of fear, that's really incompatible with producing the kind of protection that they claim that that they're seeking.
Yeah, I mean, you just you touched on earlier about how there was a difference in between, you know, the way Black women are treated and the way white women are treated in the criminal justice system. Statistics show about how Black women are 22% more likely to be found guilty than white women in magistrates' courts, and that's where, you know, the vast majority of cases are heard. What does that kind of tell us about the everyday cases of justice, as opposed to the high-profile Crown Court cases people tend to focus on?
It's a good question. I think it's really highly significant. As you say, you know, magistrates' courts are where the vast majority of criminal cases are heard. So we might hear about, you know, the rare, exciting, sexy Crown Court case, you know, high-profile case. But these magistrate court cases are where the, like, ordinary machinery of justice is turning, you know. So, like, the importance of magistrates courts is really in, like, the routineness of them and, you know, the high volume of them. So that's where the everyday criminalization occurs, where these processes, you know, how they continue into the criminal justice system. And so, you know, these disparities really kind of shine a light on very large cumulative effects beyond the guilty conviction. So, I mean, it's quite a considerable disparity. Like 22% is, like, that's not a small number. And it just speaks to how deeply embedded these inequalities are in the lower, kind of more routine tiers of the system. In the magistrates court, cases are being churned quickly, The cases are less expensive, there's less scrutiny, they're kind of seen as less high stakes. And what that means is, the speed of the operation kind of relies more greatly on things like stereotypes and assumptions of magistrates. I've come across a lot of research showing that a lot of Black defendants will choose to have a case heard in the Crown Court, even though the potential conviction, the sentence is much higher, but because they're hoping that having a jury of their peers might go in some way towards minimizing the biases they may experience from magistrates, like in the magistrates court, so they're almost like taking their chances with a jury of their peers rather than relying on a magistrate. And, that is real, and that has been ongoing for some time. In the magistrate court, things like, demeanor, or perceptions of demeanor, I should say, perceptions of credibility, whether somebody is seen as compliant, whether somebody is seen as humble, these assumptions about respectability, about racialized assumptions about femininity, all of these things can really influence decisions in ways that are selective, that are difficult to detect, but really highly consequential. So, I think that's why the focus shouldn't be just on high profile cases where we see these extraordinary miscarriages of justice. We don't have to look really any further than the ordinary cases. They reveal the system's kind of baseline values. That statistic that really demonstrates that structural bias is happening every day, and it's administratively normalized in the court system.
Yeah. And, we've touched upon early intervention, policing, stop and search, systematic racism, and we see how in the UK population, Black women make up 3% of it, but 8.9% of the prison population. Can we say that all these factors kind of contribute to why we're seeing such an overrepresentation of Black women in the prisons?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all of these things, it's all these things that we've touched on. And those figures, they really point to this enduring problem of racial disproportionality. And, they can't be explained by individual behavior or individual factors. It's a pattern. And it's a pattern that tells us also that prison's being used as a substitute for social problems, for failures, institutional failings in housing, in safeguarding, welfare, mental health, all these things. So, Black women are overrepresented in prison because of, all the things we've been speaking about, a combination of historical and contemporary factors, structural racism, stop and search, poverty, insecure housing, and criminalization of survival strategies. Black women are much more likely to be watched, arrested, prosecuted, imprisoned for behavior that is often rooted in survival and adversity, So, for example, low level offending can often be linked to poverty or coercion, coercive relationships. That can lead to, criminal justice being drawn into the criminal justice system, whereas, something like community-based support would have been much more of an appropriate response. The prison system reflects these wider inequalities. And it really kind of highlights the deep structural disadvantage a lot of Black families kind of live within in contemporary Britain. Things like housing exclusion, for example, really matter because housing instability increases vulnerability and increases the likelihood of entering into the criminal justice system. It increases vulnerability. So, a Black woman whose housing is unstable, whose health needs aren't being met, who is supporting children, is much more exposed to criminalization than a Black woman with stable income and housing. And, it should never be forgotten that prison is the endpoint of multiple system failures. It's not the corrective. So it's never about individual offending. Prison overrepresentation is you should really think about it as kind of the endpoint of a long chain of structural inequality rather than as evidence of propensity to criminality among some of these communities.
Yeah. We're talking about women in prison and with a focus on sort of maternal care and healthcare. The Prison Reform Trust's 2025 report found that 2/3 of mother and baby units within prison are operating above safe capacity. When a system is already overwhelmed, we can fall into assumptions that communities less tended to will fall through those cracks. So where can we say that leaves Black and brown mothers?
Well, as you say, the system's already under really severe strain. And, women who are the least well served by institutions, racialized women, marginalized women, are also then likely to be the most vulnerable or the most being mishandled by the system. So Black mothers in this context, they can face compounded disadvantage because they're more likely to be kind of considered as undeserving, they're less protected, being considered as more difficult by staff, misunderstood, language barriers, all these things. So institutions that already operate with racial bias, it really kind of compounds the harms that these Black mothers may face. So overcrowding matters ethically. It reduces privacy, it reduces personalized support, things like breastfeeding support, mental health care. And it reduces the ability of, the prison system to respond to crises in a way that is, humane and empathetic and trauma informed. So, for example, a Black mother in a crowded mother and baby unit, they may struggle to get, kind of consistent attention. Their concerns might be dismissed or her communication might be misread through racial stereotypes. Is the kind of thing that can actually happen in practice. So the deeper issue is that overcrowding turns what should be a safeguarding environment into a resource battle. It's about resource scarcity, and scarcity tends to magnify inequality, as you said. So when we already have a strain on resources, the group that is seen as less deserving, less worthy, seen as kind of more inherently dangerous or risky, the majority of they're kind of going to bear the majority of the dismissal, the routine dismissal. So for Black mothers, that can mean being the first to be deprioritized when resources run thin. So Black mothers are kind of facing these additional layers of scrutiny due to racialized perceptions of risk and of parenting. And that can have a really long-term impact on children, of course, being placed into care systems, and then all the disadvantages that can flow from that intergenerationally, as they become adults and as they then also become the racialized subject. So, this inequality that takes place in prison is really just one of the many pieces of the puzzle in terms of how Black women experience and navigate the criminal justice system and beyond.
Yeah, you touched on about how children are then impacted and how it's basically just a vicious circle, and how it's from birth to age 2. It's considered a critical time for bonding and development, and separation during this time, or a Black or brown woman that is in prison, it risks serious lifelong consequences for that child. So for Black children whose mothers are in prison during this window, it almost seems like we're just storing up further disadvantage in a system that already over-surveils Black communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a separation during the first few years, really the first really critical years, can have really profound and lasting consequences. That period is really critical for attachment, development, emotional regulation. And, specifically for Black children, the harm is amplified when maternal imprisonment occurs in this kind of broader context of over surveillance and intergenerational inequality, so, as they get older, kind of moving into this world that's hostile towards them. Beyond the family issue, it's a public policy issue. It's a structural issue. Prisons aren't designed around caregiving relationships. And for Black children, those harms are then compounded by existing inequalities in education once they join school, thinking about things like exclusion, being considered unruly, being considered aggressive, all those things, but then also kind of health and social care systems. So it's kind of layering these disadvantages across generations via this kind of early institutional separation. So the custodial punishment of the mother doesn't just impact the mother, it also impacts their children and, the kin networks and community life more broadly. And that's why alternatives to custody for mothers of very young children are not just the rational response, but also the ethical and empathetic response when we're thinking about child development, and when we're thinking about what the appropriate social policy response should be.
Yeah. And moving on to more healthcare, in prisons, we see how individuals are disproportionately diagnosed at a later stage of cancer as a focus, and often caused by infrequent cancer screenings. Focusing on Black women in particular, they face, outside of prison, they face significant health disparities. They're being impacted by systemic racism. They face systemic healthcare neglect and systems that are historically under-equipped to handle Black women's specific medical needs. What do you think about this information that reflects about how UK prisons are run in terms of healthcare and how certain communities are treated?
Well, the data kind of reflects a prison system that tends to quickly to be reactive rather than preventive, and is often poorly aligned with the realities of disparities of health in for Black and minority women. So, for Black women, there's been this kind of long-standing racialized disbelief about their suffering. So Black women have had this like kind of documented history of institutionalized overlooking across healthcare systems. We've been talking a lot about the criminal justice system, but these same inequalities, they unfold across all institutions. So the examples that I'm thinking of, this kind of carceral environment allows women who are already vulnerable, their reproductive health, for example, to be neglected. And, those failures can really become fatal. So, you mentioned kind of late cancer diagnosis. Black women face racial inequality in healthcare access and in outcomes. And prison can just intensify those inequalities through things like delayed screening, poor referral pathways, staff not being cognizant of how to recognize how symptoms present in different people. I remember like having a rash once. I had a rash once. And I spoke to the GP and they were like, "What color is it?" And I was like, "It's brown, like my skin." And they were like, they were like, "What color is it?" And I was like, "I don't know what to tell you. It's brown, like my skin." And historically, obviously, like in terms of testing, there hasn't been an understanding always of how symptoms might present on different bodies, and different skin colors. So sometimes staff cannot, part of the problem can be staff aren't trained to recognize, how symptoms look different on different people. But, evidence also consistently shows delayed diagnosis in prisons, and inconsistent access to screening. Those pre-existing inequalities in the healthcare from the NHS, those are then compounded in custody.
Yeah, like you said, prisons just almost magnify that already systemic issues.
Exactly, yeah.
And you spoke about your rash. I was going to say, I do work as a support worker, and we have first aid courses every year. And it was only this year that when someone's, if they fainted or passed out in the recovery position, and they say about how in general, they used to say about how a person's colour on their face would have flushed.
Yeah.
So only recently, like so said, if it's a darker skinned person, you have to look on the inner lip to see if their colour has changed. It just made me think about that, how it's just, why is it only now that sort of information has been given to us and to medical professionals?
Yeah. I mean, it's really quite unfathomable. I've only been hearing about that kind of thing in the last couple of years, in the last few years. And, think about like the number of people who, I don't know, could have been saved, could have had sooner medical intervention if there just was more awareness of how symptoms present on different people. Like, and this is not just a race thing, it's also a gender thing. A lot of the in medical textbooks, I guess the like analysis of symptoms has tended historically to be, testing being done on men. And I think like it's still the case. So there's a real blind spot. I mean, it's too big to be called a blind spot. It's a real kind of lack of awareness about how different symptoms present on different people and on different bodies. And of course that has like a really significant impact on intervention.
Yeah. And we've spoken about how it's not really changed the systemic racism in terms of from 70s onwards. And that sort of brings me to your paper, your research on suspect communities, focusing on policing, race, and Black Britons. And you highlight how little has changed policing Black communities since the 70s, with there being negative and racist-driven perceptions from authority figures. How do you feel it is in 2026 regarding Black and brown women?
I think I think a lot of what's changed is the rhetoric and like the vocabulary around these things. So I think, rhetoric and policing priorities have changed over time. We've seen kind of different eras where there's been kind of different focus on a specific policing issue. So in the 70s, it was mugging. In the 80s, it was riots. In the 90s, it was yardies, drugs. And then in the last like 20 years or so, we've seen a real considerable shift towards discourses around